So good morning. Welcome to Intensity Week 1. This is understanding real estate contracts and processes. Now, as I just mentioned, this was going to be drinking from a fire hose. So this will be something that you guys will probably want to reference back to and kind of make sure you really get a grasp on. There we go. So what happens when you have a client that's ready to write a contract? That's kind of the theme for today. We're going to review common terms associated with real estate contracts. We're going to review the processes of real estate contracts and addenda. We're going to discuss the differences between the types of real estate contracts, and then we're going to look at important key features or differences of certain documents. I know that sounds totally captivating. So what exactly is a contract? In real estate, this is something important for us to really kind of wrap our head around. And very overly simplified, it's an agreement between two entities to either do or not do something. An agreement between the parties should be aimed at creating a legally binding relationship and not just an exchange of unenforceable promises. So, how many of you guys have ever gotten a new cell phone? How many of you have ever gotten the 57-page cell phone agreement? How many of you have ever read it? No. I have. Yeah. All 57 pages of it. That contract is about as one-sided as you could possibly imagine. It is all the obligation on me as the user and very little obligation above, I'm going to make sure your phone has intermittent cell service sometimes. That's about the extent of their obligation to us. So, is that contract something that we would want to strive for as a model for contracts? No. No, because the idea is we want a contract that creates a legally binding relationship. Buyer has obligations, seller has obligations, and now those obligations come together in the form of a contract. That is how it really should be. More and more now, we get these ambiguous contracts or people that write terms into contracts that are conflicting that end up causing all sorts of problems. We're going to talk about that a little bit. So here are some terms in real estate that we really want to understand. And if at any point you guys have questions, feel free to stop me and we'll talk through it. Understanding, the contract has to be properly understood by both parties who are entering into it. It shouldn't be the case that the contract means different things for the two parties. Now, here's what happens in real estate. Buyers go through, they sign these contracts. 80% of the agents that are out there cannot properly explain the real estate contract. So what happens is we have clients that are signing contracts that do not fully understand what they are obligating themselves to. This will potentially get a lot of people into a lot of trouble at some point. It hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. It's just a matter of time. Offer and acceptance. So we have an offer. I offer you $100,000 for your home. You counter back at $1 million. I don't accept it. Do we have a contract? No. We have an offer and we have a counter offer. Now, what gets confusing for people is we talk about the real estate contract. What we really have is an offer that becomes a contract once both parties agree to all of the terms. So that document, when it's only signed by the buyers, is an offer, but we still call it the as-is contract. But I need for you to really understand that it is not truly a contract until both parties have agreed to all of the terms. So if you make an offer and the other side doesn't accept it, you don't have a contract. And then the intention. The eventual intention of the contract should be to enter into a legally binding relationship. So I'll give you guys another example. I have an investor. The investor likes 3 properties. They only want to buy 1, but they want to write offers on all 3 to see which one they can get the right deal on. Should we do that? No, but it happens every day. So then what they say is, oh, well, don't worry about it. You've got the 10-day or 14-day inspection. We can just back out. Well, what about that seller who now thinks they have a legitimate offer on their property, and then all of a sudden they get a slightly better deal on a house somewhere else, and they go, nah, just kidding, we're going to cancel it. Well, how many other opportunities have you kept that seller from being able to accept because you were playing games? So anytime that I've had an investor that's like, hey, let's write an offer on both, I always go back and say, no, which one do you want to start with? We can always come back to the other one if it's not under contract yet, but we need to do one at a time because it's just not fair. It's not the right way to do things. So the intention should always be, if we are writing an offer, the intention should be that we want to fulfill that contract. And qualified. This is probably one of the biggest, most important terms that we're going to talk about. Both parties should be qualified. Now, what does that mean?
The seller should own the property, for one thing.
Or we should have access to all of the sellers. Husband and wife are getting a divorce. Wife has moved out. You meet with the husband. Husband's ready to sell the house. You don't have the wife present. The wife's name is still on it. Short of an attorney having executed a quitclaim deed that takes the wife off of it or vice versa, you have to have both parties. So it's always important when you're looking at a property that you're getting ready to list, that you look at how the names are on the tax record for that particular piece of property. I've also had another example. Legal description, it's titled to Mary Smith. Mary Smith passed away 3 months ago. Her kids are now selling the property. So now what I have to do is go, okay, well, I need to talk to Mary Smith. Well, Mary Smith is dead. Okay, cool. So what I need now is I need paperwork from an attorney showing that you children now have the power to execute this contract on mom's behalf. I have to have some sort of documentation to show that the name on the contract does not match the name in the tax records. So we need to make sure that both the buyer and the seller are qualified. Now, for a buyer, this means either proof of funds or a pre-approval by a lender. Because anybody can say, hey, yeah, I'm qualified to buy a house. As a real estate agent, I'm not getting into your finances. I couldn't care less. As long as you have a lender or you have a banker that's willing to write me a letter and say, yep, this person can qualify for a purchase at this price, we're good to go. I don't get into lending. I don't get into finances. I don't need to know your credit score. I don't need to know any of that. All I need to know is that you've got somebody or some way to be able to purchase this house. That's it. As real estate agents, a lot of people try and get in and go, okay, well, let me talk to your lender and let me make sure you've got this credit score and you've got this and you've got that. That's not our place. We need to stay in our lane and we need to sell real estate. Let the lenders do what they do and have a good relationship with your lender. I don't care who your lender is, but have a good relationship with them. I have 2 very simple rules for my lender. I want good news fast and bad news faster. And I don't want to chase you down for updates. If you will live up to those 2 things, we're going to be just fine. I don't want to have to go, hey, where's this? Where's that? I want weekly updates. I want a phone call. I want to know where we are. And I want bad news even before the buyer gets it. If something is looming on the horizon that might be a problem, I want to know about it now so I can start working on solutions before I get that frantic call from a buyer. Oh no, I've got to get this, I got to get that. We've already been working on it. No, we're good. Because what's going to happen is they're going to come to you, and if I'm as blindsided by it as they are, now we're both scrambling for solutions. So, good news fast, bad news faster, don't want to chase them down. Consideration. So unless there's consideration for the property, there wouldn't be a need for a contract. Consideration just means money. If I'm just going to give you my house, do we need to execute this whole 12-page document? No. We're going to go to an attorney and we're going to do a transfer of deed. But if there's consideration, if there's money involved, now we need a real estate contract. Because now there are terms that everybody has to live up to. And then enforceability. So this is where we get into trouble when people start adding things on page 11 of the contract or page 12 of the contract. Those additional terms, we need to be very specific and very careful about what we put in that box. Because what's happened is agents have kind of gone rogue and just wrote stuff in that box that completely negated other enforceable terms of the contract. We aren't real estate attorneys. We should not be writing legal terms to the contract. So what we need to make sure is that this contract is enforceable. And really, the only time enforceability comes in is if there's a dispute. oh, well, the contract said this and you're doing that. Now we have a dispute. Or I'm canceling the contract and I want my escrow money back. Okay, well, we need to go through the contract to make sure certain terms have been upheld. And there are three primary components to what we call a real estate contract. We have a rider, we have an addendum, and we have a disclosure. Do you guys know kind of the differences between these? Raise a hand.
I was gonna say riders are before, well, can be included before it's executed, and I think maybe addendums after it's executed.
Yep, yeah, you're exactly right. So a rider is something that is part of the contract at the initial signing. So this would be things like your HOA rider, or a CDD rider, or a sinkhole disclosure. All disclosures we're gonna get into. But there are things that accompany the contract at the time of signing. An addendum is something that gets added after the contract is signed. So something changes, a repair addendum, an FHA addendum. Technically, if we included it first, it's actually a rider, but we still call it an addendum. So this is something that gets executed after that contract. And then a disclosure is basically exactly what it says. It is disclosing information. So things like a sinkhole disclosure. It says that I'm not aware of any sinkhole activity, or I am aware of sinkhole activity. It's being disclosed.
Can you say rider?
So a rider is anything that gets accompanied to the contract. So things like, I just went through them and now my brain is stumped. HOA, thank you. HOA rider and things like that. So your disclosure, these are used if there's anything that needs to be disclosed that would impact the buyer's willingness or ability to purchase that home. Now, do we need to do a disclosure for a crack in the sidewalk? No, because it's readily observable. You can walk on the sidewalk and see a crack. Do we need to do a disclosure if there's mold behind a cabinet in the kitchen?
Yes.
Absolutely. Because it is not readily observable, so it needs to be disclosed if the seller is aware of it. Part of what we do is the seller's property disclosure. We want that seller to disclose anything that is known. Now, I'll give you guys an example. There was somebody in Florida, it's been a few years ago now, that sold a sinkhole home. They had a sinkhole settlement payment. They took the money, sold the home to a new buyer, never disclosed it. The buyer finds out there's an active sinkhole. They file a lawsuit against the sellers. The sellers are now in prison. Yeah. So I always say, even when working with investors, if they've done a renovation on a home, I want a full property disclosure filled out. One of the options on that disclosure is I don't know. And I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. If you genuinely don't know the answer, that's okay. But what I don't want is, oh, I never lived in this house, I don't know anything. Well, you just did a full renovation. You put in new cabinets, you put in new floors, you know this house probably better than somebody who lived here for 10 years and never changed anything. That's not good enough. I want the disclosure. What's that? Yeah, exactly. And that's the reality is I want their pen to paper, because the last thing I want is to be named in the lawsuit, because the presumption is that I should have known and I didn't, or I didn't ask the question. Now, there are three types of real estate contracts.
Just go back on that.
Yeah.
What do you do if that non-occupant seller absolutely refuses to do a disclosure? Because we could run across
Yes.
that.
So when you have the non-occupancy disclosure, it still says seller is unaware of any material defects that would affect the buyer's willingness, blah, 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 to purchase his home. So even if you have that signed, if there's anything the seller should know, it needs to be put on that form. It has a blank that says, you know, if seller's aware of anything, it goes here. So you're still protected, but it's, in my opinion, it's a little too ambiguous, because then now I have the burden of proof of proving that the seller should have known. Well, if I can show, hey, the seller put these cabinets up and there's mold back here, Well, now I've got to have the test done to say, oh, this mold grows at this rate, so at this size, it's been here for X number of years, blah, blah, blah. It just shifts that burden of proof. On the seller's property disclosure, the burden of proof for honesty is always on the seller. In the non-occupancy, the burden still exists on the seller, but there's a little bit of ambiguity because now I have to prove that they should have known. So, you know, that's where if you have it, you're still legally protected because that does meet the minimum criteria of what we're required. But if you can get them to do it, get the property disclosure. If not, then just make sure they understand. If you don't disclose something that is not readily observable, there is potential legal ramification for you. And just make sure they kind of know what they're in for.
So there's a separate
Non-occupancy
seller's disclosure.
Absolutely.
Okay, should have done that on our last flip.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, there we go. So there are 3 types of real estate contracts: a broker-client, a buyer-seller, and a landlord-tenant. Now, the landlord-tenant we don't do a ton with. Unless you're a certified property manager, we don't really deal with landlord-tenant. Buyer-seller is what we're talking about normally, our contract, our as-is contract. But what about the brokerage-client contract? What do you guys think that is?
Listing agreement.
Our listing agreement. Our broker disclosure to buyer form. That is technically a contract. Now, we think of it as just like some sort of disclosure, but in reality, it's a contract because it sets terms for us as a real estate professional and for the client, be it the buyer or the seller. We agree to do certain things and they in turn agree to do certain things. So by definition, that's actually a contract. So the listing buyer agreement and forms, like we just said, the buyer seller agreement or the broker to buyer agreement, the listing agreement. There's 2 main forms of contracts, and we're actually going to talk through the difference today. 95% of the time, maybe 99% of the time, we use the as-is contract. There are certain times when we would actually want to go to the residential contract, and we'll talk about that. So standard versus as-is. As-is is the industry standard, so that's the one we use primarily. So we would go with as-is. Now, for time sensitivity, this is a big thing that a lot of people really don't understand with the contract. So a contingency is something that may or may not happen. So what are some contingencies in a contract?
An appraisal contingency.
Okay, what else?
They have to sell their home.
Home to sell, inspection. Any others?
Mortgage.
Financing. Those are the big 4. So something that may or may not happen. Now we have an inspection contingency. Does the buyer have to do an inspection? No. A financing contingency. If we have a financing contingency, do they have to obtain financing? Yes. Here's a caveat. Halfway through, uncle dies, they inherit $1 million. Do they still have to get financing if they have cash? No. They could pay cash. But what happens is when you change to cash, you lose the protection that comes from lender, financing contingencies. You basically waive those to pay cash. So it gets to be kind of an interesting little dynamic. So that's why it's something that may or may not happen. And most contingencies have an automatic cancel clause if something is not done within an agreed upon time. So we have a 10-day inspection contingency. Day 11, the buyer wants to do an inspection. Can they? Sure they can.
Yeah.
But if they find something, they're
Correct.
out of contract.
The terms of that contingency have expired. You can do as many inspections as you want for as long as you want, but your contingency expired at the end of that period. Financing contingency, loan approval period. Can you get loan approval after the end of that loan approval period? Absolutely. But now your protection under that contingency is gone. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Yes, ma'am.
When you were saying about your inspection on the 11th year,
Mhm.
do they also have to, if you find something, fix it within those?
No, so within that contingency, you have to provide notice to the seller by the end of that period. So if you have a 7-day inspection period, your inspector comes out on day 7 and you send the report on day 8, you missed it.
If you have that same period, like a 7-day inspection period,
Mhm.
you send the report on the 5th day.
Yep.
But they don't sign it till after.
Doesn't matter. You made disclosure.
They just-
They wait till day 8 and then go, no, we're not gonna do it. You can still back out because you have a time-stamped document to show that you provided to the seller within that period, and the seller dragged their feet to get you an answer.
They have to come to a agreement before they.
Nope. So if I send it at 11:59 on day 7, I'm okay legally. Seller's not gonna look at it till day 8, but because I have that time-stamped document to show it was submitted to the seller within that window, I'm okay. I would not recommend that, by the way.
So the takeaway is get your inspection.
Get your inspections done
Early.
early.
So that you can send that notice.
Absolutely.
It's really drop.
Correct.
Something that needs to be corrected, you send it within the time frame, this thing needs to be corrected in your week from close, can you still cancel because they never did?
So what it says is, at that point, you would send a repair addendum, and we're gonna take a look at that when we wrap up here. The repair addendum says the seller agrees to make the following repairs by a licensed contractor before closing. So they have up until the day of closing to finish those repairs. Now, the effective date. The effective date is defined as the date and time of the last signature or initial and delivery. Now, that's important. So technically, the last initial was done yesterday, but I didn't get the email for it until 10 o'clock this morning. What is my effective date? 10 o'clock this morning. So when it has been delivered. Now, the beautiful thing is every email we send is time and date stamped. So we have it. Back when we used to send fax machines and things like that, they weren't always stamped with the time of delivery. So then it became well, when did you actually receive it? There was some dispute over that. With e-signing and all those things now, they all have audit trails and timestamps and things like that, so we can go back to make sure.
How does that work if the cooperating agent doesn't check their email for 3-4 days?
Then your effective period doesn't start until they get it to you. So let's say you're the listing agent. Everything is signed, you send it to the buyer's agent, and the buyer's agent doesn't see it for 3 days, it doesn't matter. Because you sent it to the date of delivery from the last signature in all parties.
So it's date of sending, actually,
Correct.
not delivery. Well, yeah, okay.
Delivery is when it was sent.
Yeah, I'm thinking delivery is when I received.
Received, yeah.
It's not.
It's when it was sent. Correct, because your email shows the timestamp of when it was sent. When the person opens it is irrelevant.
That's my
It's a misconception because for a lot of realtors, I think we think that it's the date of the last signature and initial,
Correct.
not delivery. I've
Right.
never really thought about that.
And that's where it gets funny, because I've actually had where I've done deals where the buyer is actually in Afghanistan and they're buying a house here for when they get home. So I sent it to them, it's time stamped and received back to me, but there's an 8-hour time difference. So that's when it gets to be a little bit funny, because the timestamp on it is 8 hours ahead, but there's some fixes for it because I can show it's actually my time and things like that. But that's where it gets to be a little bit like, technically they're 8 hours ahead. So it looked like it was signed at 10 p.m. when in reality it was actually signed at 2 p.m. That kind of thing. Now, the effective date can also be written on the contract in the blank area number 20 as, notwithstanding any provision of the contract, the effective date shall be an insert date. I typically do not recommend using this because I want it to be when everybody has signed or dated it. You could put number 20 that says the effective date is tomorrow, even though everybody signed it today. I don't really like that because now you're kind of fudging numbers, and so I'm not 100% sure, and I've asked attorneys why that's in there, and his response was because some attorney got paid $10,000 to put that line in the contract. It doesn't make any sense, but it's there. So now something interesting, going back to mom passed away, kids own the house. Trustees and estates cannot hold title in the state of Florida. Can a property be owned in a trust?
Yes.
Absolutely. But it cannot be owned as a trustee. So it can't be John Smith as a trustee of the 123 Main Street Trust, but it can be held as 123 Main Street Trust or Smith Family Trust. Those you can do, but it can't be John Smith as the trustee or John Jones as the personal representative of the Bob Jones estate. The Bob Jones estate can own it, but John Jones as the representative cannot. Does that make sense? Because we get questions a lot that, actually, my wife just closed one. It was the property address trust. So it was like 2919 Finch Trust. Well, that was fine because that's the trust as it is held, but the trustee was actually the attorney that was handling the closing. It was kind of a big disaster, but yeah, it really was, but it happens. Now, loan commitment. When we get to the contract, we're going to talk a little bit more about loan commitment and how this can get people in trouble. But the buyer must deliver loan commitment to the seller by the loan commitment date. This is where it gets to be a little bit funky, and actually, I'm not going to get into it here. We'll come back to it. But if the loan commitment is not delivered within 7 days prior to closing, the buyer is in default. We're going to talk about that. So for terms and all of those things we just covered, do you guys have any questions so far? Okay. This is a funny video that I'm going to show you. We're going to kind of break this up before I go showing you all of the. All right. Okay, I'm not sure if it'll go to just TV or my phone.
So you're telling me you want to make sure that I convey to the seller that your offer is strong, is that correct? You get a strong offer with the 0 down and government assistance, and well, I'll check the box that says strong after I check the purchase price at lowball and the price of the FHA 0 down and all that. So you guys want me to get strong on the box? Yeah. Okay, I'll make sure it's strong. You guys got this. 3.75 is a little high. I think I'll wait a week or so to walk. I'll let you know. Oh, so you're gonna wait 3.75 is too high? Really? Really? Well, hold on. Let me just get China and spinning the rest of the world on the phone. Hey guys, yeah, Mr. Smith would like to wait to lock his 3.75 loan over $150,000 deal. So yeah, I need you to stop trading for a week. Yeah. Can you hold that for Mr. Smith? There you go. Yeah, Mr. Johnson. Oh, thanks for calling me back. Yeah, it sounded like you said you wanted to see homes on Christmas Day. That's the 25th still, right? Oh, okay. You do. Well, of course. Why wouldn't I want to show you houses on the birth of our Lord and Savior? Yeah, no, you don't celebrate. Yeah, I know. I'm one of the minority who pick up with my kids and give them presents. No, it's going to be great. I know what you're saying. Let's just say, buddy, if I rule the world, I would give you $417,000. I wouldn't bother to check your income or your credit because I know I'll sell it. But I'm not Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae or Julie Mae. I just don't make the rules. So, okay, so they were asking $250 for the house. Have you guys thought about what you want to offer yet? Okay, 107. Did you decide to buy a $50,000 Mercedes and that was a good idea? Oh, really? Come on.
Okay, so you're not going to do the roof repair before selling. Okay, great. No, I'm sure it'll still sell for top dollar. I mean, these gaping hole in the roof, no problem. Yeah, nobody needs a roof. Nobody expects that. That's what they make buckets for. Loan line? Oh, yeah, those always work.
Loan line? Oh, yeah, those are easy. Loan lines? They're great. Listen, it's a little hard for me to believe this is the first time you've heard about $46,273.76 worth of collections on your credit report.
But
Yeah, no, yeah, you do have to pay a loan.
yeah, no, I do not take offense to you asking me to put my commission. I love it when people devalue my service.
Oh, but third extension? Oh, I understand. You know, your brothers, sisters, you know, uncles, sons, bar mitzvah, it's a big event. I know. You're okay, we'll get another extension. Sure, no problem.
You know, I'm totally okay with the fact that I showed this guy 15 outfits and took my entire weekend because you totally had him pre-qualified and now he's denied at the last minute. That is just awesome. Thanks. Perfect.
200,000, you write him at 245,000, somehow that's my fault. Oh, so the guy got straightened out of that and I can't? Well, how about you tell him to go?
So that's just kind of a funny way to look at, yeah. And if you've been in real estate for more than 5 minutes, you've encountered most of those, unfortunately. Let me go over here. There we go. All right, so what I'm going to show you first is when you go into the back office, you go into forms and you go into buyer forms, you have all of the different forms that are in here. Normally, when you're working with a buyer, you're going to use the form wizard, but I'm going to show you guys a few of these addenda real quick. The property repair addendum. So this is kind of what we were talking about with, we have an inspection and now repairs need to be made. What it says here is the property inspection results identified the following items that are requested of the seller to repair by licensed contractors prior to the date of closing. So that way, what we're doing is we're just putting in there what needs to be done. And really, it should be itemized. Number 1, leaking toilet in the second bathroom. Number 2, fascia on the rear of the home. You know, number 3, whatever. You actually just itemize them out, and that way it makes sure there's no question as to what we're asking for. The worst thing you can possibly do is issues that were found on the inspection report attached need to be addressed by the seller. What's attached?
We've had that happen.
It happens all the time, and as a selling agent, it made me crazy. I don't want you to send me a 57-page report. I want you to tell me the 9 things you want me to fix.
Is it okay if you say like leaking roof as stated?
Correct, absolutely. But at least then, like number 1 says leaking roof in living room. And then you would send the pages of the report to accompany it so they know what it is. But what happens is when you use ambiguous terms on this document, we go back to enforceability. Well, what's to say that somebody didn't modify that inspection report and we don't actually know what was asked? Okay, cool, you only sent me 5 pages. Well, no, I sent you 12 pages. Here's the 5 pages I received. It happens. So be specific. I am a huge proponent for over documenting. I want everything laid out in explicit terms so there is no question as to what everybody's agreeing to.
So in that situation, so you're documenting item by item, but would you also send a copy of the report?
Absolutely, because it's going to have pictures, and that way they're able to say, okay, it's leaking on this toilet, or, you know, because if there's 3 bathrooms, well, which one is bathroom 2? You know, that kind of thing. But if there's a photo, then they go, oh, okay, that's this bathroom, this is what I need to do. But for the purposes of this document should be able to stand on its own by saying, here are the things that need to be repaired. And that way you just send the accompanying report and it's all together.
What if you have a buyer that's okay with the seller fixing, instead of a licensed contractor fixing the issues with the home?
So what I would do is I would, on the items that they're okay with that, I would put a note that says, buyer acknowledges that seller can make the following repair without the use, or by a handyman or whatever, so that it, for that particular term, you have the exception, essentially. In the event that none of it needs to be done by a licensed repair person, which gets to be kind of gray. Okay, let me step back. Even if it's done by a handyman, I want it done by a licensed handyman. There are a few things that, like caulking a tub. Okay, cool. I don't need to have a licensed plumber come in to fix the caulking on the tub. Things like that, I would just say, you know, repair not necessary by a licensed repair person or something.
Just put it like in parentheses.
Yeah, just put it in parentheses. So that way, for that particular term, we're setting the exception, but by and large, I don't want to remove that term that says, I want a licensed repair person to do it. Sure, go ahead.
What if the seller, what if the buyer agrees, what if the buyer agrees with the seller that they will pay for it with cash to fix, but not fix it? Like,
so what you would do then is you would put an addendum, a separate addendum that says, instead of repairing number 1, number 3, and number 7 from the repair report, seller agrees to give a credit for $300, $500, whatever, at closing. I still want that paper trail of what we asked for and then the paper trail of what was agreed to. The other side, and I've seen it done, and I haven't fully the jury's still out on it. Just scratching something out and just saying, you know, $500 credit in lieu of repair on that repair addendum. I've seen it, it works okay, but I would really I want all the documentation to be clean and clear. There's some others in here, the condo riders, the HOA riders, those are all pretty straightforward. The one I want to touch on here is the FHA-VA financing, because there's something different with it. Really? I don't even know what this is. Don't show me again and just do it. There we go. Okay, so with this document, as with most, and this is the other thing, all of these documents say comprehensive rider to the residential contract. That's, every single rider has that. What it's actually called is down here underneath, the FHA-VA addendum. So when you're looking for the title, it's always going to be under the initials. Because people go, well, all of it just says comprehensive rider. Which one is it? And they don't realize that the title is actually underneath. But when you get down here, down to the bottom of page 2, both the buyer's agent and the seller's agent have to sign this form. This is one of the few addenda or contract riders that require the agents to also sign it. So it's important to pay attention to that because that gets missed a lot. The other one, those are the main ones. Do you guys have any specific questions about addenda or riders in general? Okay. If you have specific questions, I mean, I could take 2 hours walking through every single one of these, but for what we're about to do, I'm not going to totally inundate you.
And just out of curiosity, I do have one question.
Sure, go ahead.
With all these different forms, obviously there's a timeline. Is there something where we can see like a timeline of when these things are going to happen in the process?
Most of it is all defined in the contract.
Okay.
So, and that's where we'll kind of walk through. So parties, the seller goes up at the top. Now, for the seller, it's important that the seller's name is exactly as it appears in the tax record. So if it's John A. Smith, it needs to say John A. Smith on the contract. Otherwise, the title company will not be able to convey title unless the names match. The buyer, the same way. If the buyer wants their middle initial on the deed, it needs to be that way on the contract. So just be aware of that. When we go into, I'll show you guys this one. When we come into the form wizard, trying to look at the screen. There we go. When we come into the buyer form wizard, really? Okay, we'll answer the 7 questions. So let's just say residential, yes. Say no. This question, do you need the condo or association riders? Ideally, the seller has always put these in the MLS. As sellers, this is what we're going to do. So the hope is that we would say no, or the rider has been provided by the seller. Your method of purchase. So when we're talking about this, if we were to click FHA-VA financing, it's automatically going to generate that FHA-VA form for us. If you come in and say, is the buyer requesting the seller to pay closing costs? Yes or no? Go ahead and fill this out. If you know that they're going to ask for 3% toward closing, put this in, and I'm going to show you why. We're going to say it's not built, and yes, they're providing the seller's disclosure. Now, what's cool is we can download this as a blank document package, or we can come down here, select your listing. I'll just do this one. Actually, I don't really need that one. You can just grab an MLS ID. You can put in the buyer name or put in the seller name, and then we can populate the document package. That's not going to work, but I didn't fill it out. When we do this package, it will actually generate the full package here. If we had filled out the bottom with the buyer or seller's name, it would automatically fill this document in for us. The one thing I wanted to point out, this other contract, with the as-is contract, if you use that and it fills out the information, the one part it will never fill out is this tax ID right there on line 9. because if you go into the tax ID, it has it shown 3 different ways, and every county does it a little bit differently as to how they do their tax IDs. There's no good way for Bill to be able to code that it always chooses option 2, because some counties only have 1 way. So it'll put in the street address, it'll put in the county, it'll put in the real property legal description, but it will not put in the tax ID. So you always have to make sure, even if the form is populated, you'll have to put that line in.
Do you recommend we always go to the deed for that information, not the property appraiser's record?
The property appraiser's record typically has to have the property ID on it, but if you can go to the deed, you know, it's fine. But if I've talked to multiple title companies, and they all said, as long as you have some variation of those 3, they can look it up. So whether you choose the blue one that's hyperlinked, that'll take you to the property appraiser's website, or the second or the third, as long as you copy one of those 3 and put it in here, they can find it. So it doesn't have to be specifically the one that's on the deed. It can be any of the 3 variations. Yes.
So the seller's name comes from the tax record. The buyer's name, does that need to be in a certain, like?
However they want it on their deed.
That's not how it's gonna be.
Yep.
Right?
So if it's John A. Smith, that's how it'll be on the deed. Yep. Now, when we come down here for personal property, I always like to highlight and stop here. So when it goes to personal property, it mentions the range, the refrigerator, the dishwasher, disposal, ceiling fans, light fixtures, drapery rods, blinds, treatment, smoke detectors, garage door openers. It does not mention water softeners. Now everybody thinks the water softener's in the garage, it's connected to the water system, it has to stay, right?
No.
1 flip of a switch, 2 screws, and that whole unit comes out, and the rest of the house works just fine. Could be rented. So if there's a water softener and your buyer wants it, make sure it's in here. Washer and dryer are not listed in those list of appliances. If your buyer wants the washer and dryer, make sure it's in there. If there's a refrigerator in the garage, it's not included in the refrigerator listed up there. That's the one in the kitchen. If there's one in the garage, it needs to be specifically notated.
We just had an instance where the seller had a Ring doorbell. Okay, it's attached to the home.
Right.
The buyer saw that there.
Uh-huh.
Okay, is that considered a fixture, or is that considered a? Oh, I didn't see far enough.
So I include that specifically because I've encountered this too.
It's expensive.
A Ring doorbell is subscription based. So you technically own a subscription to Ring for that doorbell. If I leave the Ring doorbell, you now have to get your own subscription. We have had buyers that are like, well, no, the seller's going to pay for my subscription to the doorbell because they leave the doorbell. No. So if there's something like a Ring doorbell and you specifically want it left, because it is subscription based, and I say the same thing with the video cameras. If there are cameras in the home, like the Arlo systems or whatever, those are subscription based. The seller can take all of that out, keep their subscription, and put it in their next home. It's not technically considered a fixture. So in that case, make sure your buyer understands if the seller leaves the equipment, you still have to pay for a new subscription to activate all of this stuff. Because a lot of buyers just have no idea how it works. They just look at it and go, oh, Ring doorbell, that's cool. Somebody rings the doorbell, it pops up with the camera, I can talk to them, it's all good. They don't realize that it's like 15 or 20 bucks a month or whatever it is to keep that service, even if they have that doorbell.
You know, in our case, we have a listing side.
Okay.
They've already seen the Ring doorbell. The sellers have already agreed to leave the Ring doorbell.
Okay.
But we never documented that.
Right.
Where should we go from here?
As long as everybody has agreed that, you know, there's some sort of agreement that says the Ring doorbell.
Nobody's even mentioned it.
Oh.
I mean, that was an afterthought after we already got the contract and.
I would have a conversation with the buyer's agent and see what the expectation is. Technically, if it's not here, it doesn't have to stay. They can take it with them.
Could you do that as an addendum?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I would say is if it's expected to stay, do a quick addendum that says the Ring doorbell to stay, but buyer to obtain their own subscription after closing. So that way it's there. Yeah, that has been, so in essence, the rule is if you physically took a house and turned it upside down, whatever stayed in place stayed with the house.
Well, the alarm system. I mean, I never thought of that.
I know,
It's a
most agents
picture.
don't.
It goes, stays with the house.
Well, there's
You
a
would
lot of
think
people
so.
with these smart devices, like smart outlets and things too now.
Yep.
Like
Smart light
everything's
fixtures, I
controlled.
can control a whole house with an app on my phone.
Right.
Technically, I could replace that smart light switch with another light switch,
Right.
and it works exactly the same. I haven't removed the fixture, I have removed the feature.
Right.
That's where it gets to be funny. I could take the Ring doorbell and put another doorbell back, and I haven't changed the value of the home because there's still a doorbell. There's still a way for somebody on the outside to communicate with somebody on the inside. Technically, that is acceptable.
So the way it's worded, not mentioned water softeners, is that asking for everything to stay, or is that saying that's not staying?
So if you want something to stay, it needs to be here. So a water softener, a washer, a dryer, cameras, Ring doorbells. If your buyer wants it, it needs to be put here.
Some of
Now-
them are already there.
Correct. There's a couple, like the curtains are up here with drapery rods and draperies. But the question is, what's a drapery and what's a curtain? Because technically, the drapery is the fabric, I don't know, it's way above my pay grade. But we have had arguments where the buyer or the seller left the sheer window covering, but took the blackout curtain. Well, the argument was, that's technically a drapery. The sheer part was the drapery, the other part was a curtain, and there's nothing in here that says curtain. I ended up buying a $50 set of curtains. Let's just leave it at that. But if there's a, oh yeah. It was a blackout curtain in approximately the same color. That was as far as I was going with it. But if there's ever a question that your buyer is like, hey, I specifically want to make sure this stays, then document it here. That's kind of the thing. Now, I just had a situation about a year ago. The seller was this art enthusiast, and they had these beautiful drop lights in the kitchen that had custom art covers on all of these lights. They were not leaving them. They were like $10,000 globes or something, like some ungodly number. They had specifically said, these do not convey in the MLS. I had put it in there. Buyer's agent comes in, did not put it in this document. Luckily, we caught it, but had we not, the argument could have been made, well, the buyer bought this house specifically because those things were there. If there's something that does not convey, it needs to be here. Your seller needs to understand, when they take those items out, they need to be replaced with something. You can't just take the lights out and have, wires hanging over the sink. You've got to put new drop lights in. So just make sure the following items are excluded. That's the only time I've really run into it, is it was very costly and the buyers loved it and the seller was like, absolutely not, we are not leaving them. I got these from Italy and a lot of them like, whatever. So if there's something that is excluded that should be presumed to stay, it's technically a light fixture. A light fixture is presumed to stay. You need to put those exclusions in there.
They should remove those items actually before the listing.
Correct. Yes, they should. But just for the sake of documentation. Now, this is where a lot of people kind of get confused on their earlier contracts. So the purchase price is your offer price. The escrow deposit does get credited back to the buyer at closing. A lot of buyers don't understand. They go, okay, I got to put this money in with escrow, but I never see it again. Like, that's my hold money to be able to put in the offer. So just make sure. For financing amount, I always do it as a percentage. If they're doing a conventional loan and putting 20% down, I just do financing amount as 80%. You can do a mortgage amount. So if their mortgage amount is, what is it, 140,000? 20, 10, 20, 40, yeah, 160,000. So if the mortgage is 160,000, you could put 160,000 on there, however you want to do it. So in this case, we've got our purchase price, 5,000 in escrow. The amount that's not covered by the financing is what they have to bring for this. Now, this does not include their closing costs. This does not include prepaids. This is not exactly how much money they're going to have to bring. This is just the balance to close, not including all those other things. So just make sure you guys are clear on that, because they're like, oh, the contract said 35,000 and now my lender's telling me I need to bring 45,000. Well, understand there are some additional closing costs in here that you will be responsible for.
And Greg, if they start with like a conventional loan and then they change to another type of loan or a different percentage.
When you do like if they go conventional to FHA, when you do the FHA addendum, it becomes additional to this, so it overwrites these terms. So if originally they were going to do 20% down conventional and then we do an FHA addendum, we've now changed the financing terms of this, so we don't have to go back and re-execute a new page one.
What if somebody adds additional personal funds to it?
They certainly can. So this is not set in stone. This is not like,
You have to document?
nope. So when we've had that, where, you know, buyers were like, okay, I want to put 5% down. And then the lender comes back and goes, well, if you put 10% down, you get this and this and this and better rate, better payment, blah, blah, blah. So they decide, okay, I'm going to put more money down. Well, at that point, you don't have to go back and redocument it. This is just to the best of your knowledge at the time of execution. Now, if not signed by the buyer seller by, I always typically put 5 p.m. on a date, because otherwise this is presumed to be 11/59/59 on that date. If it just has January 1st, it's 11/59/59 of January 1st. I like to do 5 p.m., but understand that at 5:01, even if the seller comes back and says, all right, cool, we'll accept your offer exactly as it is, technically at 5:01, the buyer doesn't have to go through with it anymore because their offer expired at that time. So in the event that I've got the seller or the investor that wants to put 2 properties, I may put 24 hours on this offer and have the other one ready to go, that at 5:01, we submit the offer on the other one. Because technically our offer has expired. Closing date. You must have a closing date on your contract. A lot of times they're like, well, it's contingent on the sale of the buyer's property, so we don't know exactly what the closing date will be. Well, it's got to have something. It could be on or before September 30th. But understand, if you put on or before, technically your closing date is still whatever that calendar date is. In order to close earlier than that, both the buyer and the seller have to agree to it. So I could put on or before July 30th, and the buyer may be ready to close July 15th. But the seller goes, well, no, I still need more time. I need till July 30th. You can't make the seller close early or vice versa.
Some agents have said that we're no longer allowed to put on or before, just a date. Is that something you heard?
I've talked to attorneys about it, and ultimately you can put on or before, but it always comes down to whatever that calendar date is. So it is a little bit superfluous because, again, both parties have to agree to do anything other than that calendar date. So if the expectation, and the only reason I've ever used it is if we've got a seller that wants to close as quickly as possible, and we're saying, hey, as soon as the bank can get this stuff together, we'll close it. That's when I use on or before. More often than not, I just use a date. Because then you still have the option to close before then. You know, if everybody's ready and you can close 2 weeks early, sweet, let's get it done. But if you have that closing date on there, whatever that calendar date is your legal, technical contract closing date. Now, as we go down to occupancy of possession, this is something that, I don't know how it gets missed as much as it gets missed. Line 63 says, at closing, the seller will have removed all personal items and trash from the property and will deliver keys, garage door openers, access devices, and codes to the buyer. That's a pool key. That's a mailbox key. That's a garage door opener. That's a house that does not have trash left in it. But how many times have we done the final walkthrough and there's still crap everywhere? Oh, the buyer can just take care of that. Contract says seller will have removed all personal items and trash. Does that mean it gets moved to the driveway? Removes away from the property. There have been a lot of issues with this, where the sellers leave stuff and the buyer goes, well, what can I do? Well, technically your contract says the seller will have it removed. So the seller can either get somebody over there to get it done before closing, or the seller can cut you a check at closing for you to have it done. But the seller's obligation is that they will remove all of that, and they will provide all keys. Now, the first thing I tell the buyer is change the locks the minute you move in, because you never know how many neighbors, how many cousins, how many aunts, how many have keys to your house that you don't even know. So that's always the first thing I say is change all the locks the minute you move into a house. But we've had issues with the sellers like, oh, I'm just moving in the same neighborhood, I'm gonna keep my pool key. Well, no, that's not how this works, because now my buyers have amenities that they don't have access to because you're not providing access to those amenities. That is the seller's obligation as part of this contract, and a lot of agents have no idea this is even in
Have a copy of this.
here. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, well.
Like the highlighted
I
copy?
didn't get one, but I wanted one here.
Oh,
I should have brought it.
hang on.
I wanted to make some notes on it.
Yeah, let me see. Give me just a second. Let me turn my VPN off
Should have
here.
thought of that.
FS. I don't know which one it is. Let me try that. Let's see if that prints. Thank you. Give me just a second. We'll check the printer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, assignability. I typically default to the seller may not assign this contract. So let's talk about assignability for just a second. The buyer may assign and thereby be released from liability. The buyer may assign but not be released from liability or may not assign. Here's what happens. The buyer is an investment company. They get it under contract. They call their buddy and go, hey, I've got this house under contract. If you want it, you can just take over the contract and close it. They're kind of like these middleman negotiators, and they assign these contracts out. As a seller, I am approving the terms of your purchase as you wrote it. If you can assign it and be released from liability, you just send it over to your buddy, and now all of a sudden your buddy defaults on it. I have nobody to go after because my contract still has your name, but you've assigned it to somebody else. If anything other than this last box is checked, I'm asking some questions. Are you expecting to assign this contract to somebody else? And if so, why are they not just writing up the contract themselves? You know, I really want to kind of understand why this assignability is being used.
Does this happen like with back-to-back closings?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I was just gonna ask a quick question. I was actually thinking about item 6 on the occupancy.
Okay.
I know in different parts of the country, some people believe that like you have a certain amount of time after closing
Correct.
so that you can move your stuff out. How, like, do you ever run into that here where people say, well, we'd like 10 days after closing to be able to move out? Says,
Number 9, if the property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing, understand if we check this, that means the seller is able to stay in the property after closing, but there is some immense risk for the buyer in this. Technically, if the seller stays the day after closing, they drop a piano and it falls through a window, that's the buyer's responsibility. The seller doesn't own the house anymore. Yeah. So what you would actually have to do is execute a lease for 1 day that has to be drawn up by an attorney that says, here's blah, blah, blah. So it's in the contract, but avoid it like the plague if you possibly can. Just make sure everybody's kind of clear on those expectations because it does happen.
that's why I wanted to ask.
I had a situation where a seller just decided that they wanted to leave some stuff, and it was nice stuff. It was like couches and stuff. And the buyer was fine with taking it, but we didn't really create any official document. Does that matter?
So the only time it becomes an issue is when it becomes a dispute.
Okay.
So if the buyer's like, the buyer goes in and goes, why is this a house full of furniture? I've got a truck full of furniture sitting here. Now we have a problem. If the seller says, hey, are you okay leaving the furniture? The buyer says, yeah, I'm happy to have it. there's not gonna be a dispute about it because, you know, they're okay with it, yeah. So this is just kind of to prevent disruption, dispute, that kind of thing. For financing, I'm not gonna spend a ton of time here, but A just means buyer's paying cash, there is no financing contingency. If the buyer's putting $100,000 down on a $150,000 house and they're getting a small mortgage, are they paying cash? No. A lot of people get really confused because they're like, well, the buyer's putting 90% down and they're only getting a loan for a very small part. Well, technically, they're still getting a loan for a very small part. So we need to make sure that we are doing that. I always check fixed or adjustable because, again, I don't want to get too involved in their financing. I don't really care what kind of loan they're getting. It doesn't make any difference. There are times when you would have a buyer where the lender's going to tell you, if the rate goes over 5.5%, this buyer's out. Like they're not able to, their payment's going to be too high, they can't swing it. Their debt to income gets thrown off. If that's the case, then put that percentage in there. Otherwise, you can leave it blank and whatever the day's rate when they lock is what it would be. Typically, that's not something you're going to encounter unless you have first-time home buyers, where they're like, hey, they can spend $1,200 a month on their debt to income and not a penny more. So,
are you finding out this out with the pre-qualification? Is that how you're finding it out?
typically, not all pre-qualifications are done equally. So some lenders will just put it out there that goes, oh, you're approved for $110,000. They don't have a rate, they don't have, you know, whatever. So having lenders that you work with, that you have good rapport with, that you can ask those questions is a good thing. Sometimes buyers are going to come to you and go, oh, they did my mom's mortgage and they were fantastic, so I want to use them and I have no idea who they are. I'm going to call and have a talk with the lender and just be like, hey, let's make sure this is all on the up and up and things like that. Now, when you get down here, the buyer's failure to use diligent effort to obtain loan approval during the loan approval period is considered a default under the terms of this contract. What does diligent effort mean?
Better get going.
Okay. A buyer quits their job in the middle of the loan application and gets denied. Is that diligent effort? Is the buyer going to get their escrow back at that point? Not if I'm the selling agent. But the argument is, well, I have a financing contingency that says if I can't get approved for the loan, I get my escrow back. Well, there's a contract here that says you're going to use diligent effort. Is being a dum-dum and quitting your job in the middle of a loan process using diligent effort? Nope.
Buying a car.
I can prove that.
Buying a $50,000 car? Oh, I'm going to call the lender. Why do you have to deny them? Oh, they quit their job.
As a seller.
I'm calling the lender.
Yeah, you can-
Oh, I'm calling the lender 100%. Absolutely. This protects more sellers, and agents have no idea it's in here.
But what if they get laid off? You know, it's not by anything they did.
Again, I'm going to talk to the lender and kind of figure it out. Sometimes if it's $1,000 escrow, you're going to spend $1,000 in legal fees by the time you go to mediation and do all that to get it back. If it's a $20,000 escrow, we might be talking about something different. So again, it kind of depends, but the buyers need to understand their obligations when they sign this contract. It says, buyer's failure to use diligent effort to obtain loan approval shall be considered default. If you default on this contract, you're not getting your escrow back.
But isn't the buyer's agent or with the lender has more of a rapport with the
Sure.
lender than the seller's agent? So how would you get any of that?
As a seller's agent, right from the beginning, I'm going to call the lender. Before I accept the offer, I talk to every buyer's lender. Hey, have you actually seen docs? Do you actually have pay stubs and bank statements from this buyer in your possession right now? If they tell me no, okay, cool. I'm going back to the buyer's agent. I need a pre-approval letter. When they submit those documents, come back to me.
Just going back a little bit, the escrow deposit, what do you recommend as a escrow deposit, 1%?
If it's financed, I want a minimum of 1%. Because if the buyer doesn't have 1% to put into cash, the lowest financing is going to be 3.5%. So if they don't at least have 1%, we've already got problems. If it's a cash buyer, I want about 10%.
Okay.
If you're gonna pay cash, what difference does it make if you put 10% now and the other 90%, 2 weeks from now?
They're risking that.
Correct. So if you're a cash buyer and you've got the cash to be able to make this purchase, go ahead and put some skin in the game. Because cash buyers, everybody's like, oh, I want a cash buyer. I've seen more cash deals go pear-shaped than finance deals. Because they're like, oh, I've got the cash. I've got $1,000 in escrow and I find a better house. I've got $350,000. I'll walk away from that $1,000 to be able to go buy the house I want, and deals fall apart that you think are slam dunks because they don't have any skin in the game. So yeah, if it's financing, I want 1%. If it's cash, I want 10. I don't always get it, but that's what I'm gonna ask for. If I've got a $300,000 cash deal and they want to put $1,000 in escrow, it's not fine. So that's a very good question. So, and now, for purposes of the provision, diligent effort includes, so it actually tells you what diligent effort means. Timely furnishing of all documents and information and paying of all fees and charges by the buyer's broker and lender in connection with the buyer's mortgage loan application. It's clear, timely deliverance. The lender calls and goes, hey, I've been asking this buyer for documents for 2 weeks now and I can't get it, so now I need an extension. Nope. Buyer hasn't used diligent effort. We're going to cancel this contract and the seller's keeping their escrow. Now, the reality is we want to close deals. But as buyer and seller agents, we need to understand what this contract says and who's committed to what. Now, upon buyer obtaining loan approval, the buyer shall promptly deliver written notice to the seller. As a seller's agent, I love this line. So, in the loan approval period, which is right up here, so on line 87, it says within 30 days, loan approval period. So 30 days from the date of execution, I need to have some form of loan approval. Now, if I've got a 45-day closing, am I going to have loan approval in 30 days? No. But what I am going to do is I'm going to send an email. Hey, I'm going to send an email to the seller's agent that says, hey, per line 103 of the contract, I'm providing loan approval. So essentially what this says is the buyer's financing contingency expires on that time. Now, if the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval after the exercise of diligent effort, then at any time prior to the expiration of that approval period, the buyer can provide written notice and either waive loan approval or terminate the contract. Okay?
Okay, I have a buyer that we had conditional approval,
Mm-hmm.
but the appraisal, it was a commercial contract.
Yeah.
So we had a conditional approval, but the appraisal hasn't come in.
Yeah, that's okay. So
But
what you still do.
The seller wouldn't let us get an extension because of the.
Oh, I remember this one. Okay. In this instance, so what this is talking about is just providing documentation to the seller before the end of that loan approval period, saying that the lending is solid. In that case, if you're on day 30 and there's something out there that you're like, hey, we're still waiting on this, blah, 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 I would go ahead and do a financing contingency extension to extend this loan approval period. That's always an option. Why this is important is, on the next page, if the buyer fails to deliver written notice or, let's see, above to the seller, then the loan approval is deemed waived, in which the contract will continue as if loan approval had been obtained. However, and this is a big old however, the seller may elect to terminate this contract by delivering written notice to the buyer within 3 days after the extension of the loan approval. This happened to one of our agents that was the listing agent. They executed a contract. They took a financed offer. 3 days later, somebody said, look, I'll give you $5,000 more than contract price in cash. They're like, look, we're locked into contract. I can't take that offer, but I'm going to hold it as a backup. Day 30 comes. Buyer doesn't provide loan approval. Day 31, seller sends notice to the buyer and says, we're canceling your contract, I'm taking this cash offer. Buyer's agent loses their mind. What are you talking about? You can't do that. Line 109 says, I certainly can. That buyer is totally out. Seller canceled the contract, took the cash offer, because the buyer's agent didn't know what they were supposed to do under the terms of the contract. It's not something that happens, honestly. As the seller's agent, I don't even talk to my sellers about this unless it becomes pertinent, because I don't want to give them any reason to think we can cancel this contract. 99% of the time, what happens is that 30 days comes and goes, the 3 days comes and goes, and then the contract just carries on. Nobody's the wiser. But in that really weird instance where the seller is looking for an out, it's right there.
And it's come close on a few deals where, you know, as the buyer's agent, a few days ahead, you should contact the lender.
Yep. Hey, we're up against loan approval period. Are we
CC your
okay?
buyer on that, you know, that yes, we need this. And then they're right down to the wire sometimes.
Yep.
And
Now, it doesn't always have to be a letter from the lender. You could send an email to the other agent that just says, hey, per line 103 of the contract, we are fulfilling, we're sending notification. Notification can be an email. It doesn't have to be a letter from the lender. That's what we want it to be. But I, as an agent, can just send an email and say, hey, I talked to the lender, everything's good, loan approval, consider this notification. And you're okay with that because it's written documentation, it's timestamped.
Lenders, and preferably email.
Correct.
Wouldn't it be smarter just to write the finance contingency all the way up to the closing date?
If you can get a seller that'll go for it. As a seller's agent, no. If your financing is going to fall apart, I want to know about it before my buyers have gotten a moving truck and locked down all these other things. I want at least 7 to 10 day leeway before they're spending all their money. It's the day before closing, and then the buyer goes, oh, just kidding, I'm out. And now my seller has $1,000 in a moving truck and blah, 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 and we're not closing. So it depends on which side of the deal you're on. On the buyer side, absolutely. I want it right to the day of closing.
So this kind of confuses me. The loan approval is separate from the pre-approval.
Correct. So the pre-approval just means the lender has looked at their documents, looked at their finances, and said, yes, you have the capacity to purchase a home up to this point. This loan approval means they've submitted all their documents, they've done formal application, they've done an appraisal, they've done an inspection, and the house is ready to be purchased. So this just basically says, hey, we're 30 days into this contract. Everything looks good. We're just waiting on 1 or 2 things for final underwriting, but we're good to go.
Have them when they do the clear to close, or is that separate?
Ideally, you would like to have clear to close by this, but it almost never happens that way. So this is where you're just going to have a conversation with the lender and say, hey, our loan approval period ends tomorrow. I just want to make sure there's nothing out there that might derail this. Because if we're 30 days into a 35 or 40 day closing, if there's something wrong, good news fast, bad news faster. I should have already known about it. So that's where this loan approval kind of comes into play. It's not a clear to close because you will almost never have that this far in advance. If you do, awesome, but it doesn't always work that way. Does that make sense? Okay.
So this is considered the commitment to lend?
Correct. This is just a commitment to lend. Yeah.
Have you ever heard of an agent, the buyer's agent, not doing this, not following up, getting the loan commitment and being sued because the deal falls apart?
I haven't heard of it, but I'm sure it happens. Because that agent where the seller canceled the contract on them, they were like 9 days from closing. The buyer's thinking they're buying this house, and now all of a sudden, because their agent didn't properly tell them. Now, technically, it is the buyer's responsibility to understand this document before they sign it. Most people expect us as real estate agents, if there's something important like that, we're going to tell them. It's legally, as real estate agents, we are kind of released from that liability, and it's in here. But that's one of those times where it's like, as agents, we really need to understand this contract, because I'm sure there's a lawsuit somewhere, whether or not it went anywhere, where the buyer sued the agent because they're like, well, you didn't tell me that. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Closing costs to be paid by the buyer. By default, this comes in as a real estate documentation fee. For here, all right, 99% of the time, we're gonna check box 158. The seller picks the closing agent and pays for the owner's policy, and the buyer pays for the lender's policy. Now, on a cash deal, there is no lender's title policy. There is no lender. So the buyer technically doesn't have to pay this $500 for the policy that they would normally pay for. So on a cash deal, if you're on the selling side, you can always negotiate that the buyer pays for the owner's policy, because that's technically what they're receiving. They are the new owners. That is the policy that they are receiving. It is totally negotiable. Even if the seller picks the closing agent, the buyer can still pay for the owner's policy. So just understand there's some negotiation here, especially on cash deals, because this just says the buyer pays for the buyer's lender's policy and there won't be one. So 99% of the time, you're gonna pick 158. The seller picks the title company, seller pays for the owner's title policy. That's just how we do it in Florida. In other states, that's not the case. But in Florida, if it's financed or even if it's cash and you represent the buyer, you're still advantageous to check option A. If you happen to be a seller and you get a cash offer, you can always change this so that your seller does a little bit better. Miami-Dade, just ignore. Miami is its own planet. We don't even deal with it that much. Line 173. So a home warranty, buyer, seller, or nobody. This is always a good thing. If you have a buyer, you can always negotiate the seller to pay for a home warranty. This is where it would go in. There's a number of companies, 210, Old Republic, I don't know, there's like 6 or 7 of them. They're all about the same. What is it? American Home Shield, yeah. They're all about the same. They run between $350 and $550, depending on what they cover. So if your buyer wants one, that's where you would include it. And then when we get down here to the special assessments, seller will pay installments due prior to closing and buyer pays installments after closing. Option B is the seller pays the assessment in full. If I have the buyer, I'm defaulting to 185. Here's why. And this actually happened. I had a buyer about 3 years ago now. They were buying a home. Halfway through the process, there was a street assessment that came in. It was going to be $10,000 a year, $2,500 a year for 4 years. Okay? Technically, if I had checked A, my buyer would have been on the hook for that 10 grand. But that would have completely ruined my buyer's ability to buy this house. Their financing was so razor thin that an extra $2,500 a year on their taxes would have, that's another $200 a month in their payment, would have completely ruined the deal. So because I checked B, the seller pays the assessment in full, the seller actually had to stroke a check for the full 10 grand at closing to pay off that road assessment.
I had an agent check that and we had to change it because we wanted it A.
Right.
You know.
Depends on which side you're on.
Sure.
If you're on the seller side, I want A. If you're on the buyer side, I want B. If neither one is checked, then option A is selected. So if the buyer's agent isn't smart enough to know which one to check, leave it blank if you got to sell it.
But you won't know that writing the offer. You won't know about these special assessments.
Not always.
So how?
That should be something that's disclosed if it's someone.
If they knew, but sometimes they don't know. The other one is roof assessments. So HOA comes in and goes, hey, by the way, it's January 1st. We went under contract December 20th. It's January 1st, and we just decided that we're doing a roof assessment for this year. Starting February 1, everybody's on the hook for $50 a month for a year or whatever, for a new roof. Okay, again, your buyer may be okay with that, but it depends on the buyer's situation. So if you have the buyer, option B is always the safer option. Now, paragraph 9F does not apply to a special benefit tax lien imposed by a CDD. CDDs are their own world, they play in their own sandbox, and this does not apply to a CDD. So if you have a community that has a CDD, just pay attention because they can do all sorts of wonky things, and this contract doesn't really touch CDDs. That's kind of its own can of worms. So just pay attention to that. Any questions about that before we move on?
There was a separate contract with CDs, right?
Correct. Yep. Now, permit disclosure. I like to touch on this because this is one of the difference between the as-is and the standard contract. If the seller identifies permits which have not been closed or improvements that weren't permitted, then the seller will promptly deliver to the buyer all plans, written documentation, or other information in the seller's possession, knowledge, or control relating to the improvements which are subject to open permits. It is the seller's responsibility to identify these. Now, in all likelihood, the title company is going to find it. But as soon as the seller has been made aware of it, this now becomes an obligation on the seller. Because it says, if seller identifies permits, or what it should say is, if permits have been identified for the seller. So they need to go in and actually, it is the seller's responsibility to remedy those open permits prior to closing. Flood zone, and I'll touch too much on that one. Now, HOA, HOA or community disclosure. This is in here. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. And I guarantee you, most agents have no idea. The buyer should not execute this contract until the buyer has received and read the homeowners association disclosure, if applicable. It's all caps. If it's in an HOA community, your buyer should not be executing this contract until they've seen that HOA addendum and know what they're agreeing to. So I come in there, I've got the seller, the buyer comes in 3, 5, whatever days later, I put the HOA documents in the HOA or in the MLS with my listing. So all of those documents are there. Buyer comes back 5 days later and goes, well, I need to cancel because this HOA doesn't allow me to park my work truck here. Nope. Now you're still in inspection, you're still in other contingencies that would allow that to still cancel. But if that's the only reason that you had to cancel the contract, nope.
Another big one is motorcycles.
Exactly. Yep. Motorcycles, boats, things like that. So it flat out says right here, the buyer should not execute this until they've received and read the documents. Well, it says the HOA disclosure, but I really want my buyer to look at all of the HOA bylaws and everything before we go doing this. So it's in the contract. It's right there. The seller's disclosure. Now, again, this is where that non-occupancy disclosure part comes in. The seller knows of no facts that materially affect the value of the real property which are not readily observable and which have not been disclosed to the buyer, except as provided for in the preceding sentence. The seller extends and intends no warranty and makes no representation, blah, blah, blah. So this is an as-is contract. But it says in here, the seller has no knowledge. If the seller does have knowledge, it has to be disclosed. So again, it's just the third time now that this comes in that we have it. The inspection, this is where you put your number of days for inspection. But starting on line 258, unless the buyer exercises the right to terminate, the buyer accepts the physical condition of the property and any violation of governmental, building, environmental, and safety codes, subject to continuing on an as-is maintenance requirement, which we're going to talk about. The buyer is responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by the lender. So what does this really say? On an as-is contract, we can ask the seller to make repairs. The seller doesn't have to. The buyer is moving forward on an as-is contract. If we get through the inspection period and the buyer doesn't cancel because the seller's not willing to make repairs, then the buyer is technically obligated to make any repairs required by their lender. The buyer can pay for repairs. People go, no, the buyer can't pay to have that roof leak addressed. Of course they can. Line 262 says they can pay for any improvements required by their lender. Why not?
What if the contractor that's hired by the buyer prior to closing does a bad job on it?
Technically, it's still the buyer's obligation. Because the buyer's going to be the one moving into it. So that's where their obligation comes in. So I have had instances where the seller's like, hey, I'm willing to spend $1,000 to get the repairs done. The repair's gonna be $1,300. My buyer goes, you know what, I'll pay the other $300, not a problem, let's just get this done. I want the house, I'm okay with that. As long as it's all documented, you can do that all day. The buyer could pay the $1,300 to have it done. On an as-is contract, the seller does not have to make repairs whatsoever. So just kind of understand that.
But the buyer's agent can always ask.
Correct, and you should,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Agents keep saying, oh, but it's an as-is contract, I don't have to, well, we still are.
Yeah, we can ask. The seller just has the obligation that they can either agree or disagree to do it. But yeah, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So now the walkthrough inspection. On the day prior to closing or on closing date prior to the time of closing, the buyer or the buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough and follow-up walkthrough if necessary, inspection of the property solely. Now here's where it gets important. Solely to confirm that all items of personal property are on the property and to verify that the seller has maintained the property as required by the as-is maintenance agreement and has met all other contractual obligations. Now, does this mean you walk in and go, oh, there's a hole punch in the wall. That needs to be repaired. Oh, the floors haven't been swept. No. This is, does the air conditioner still work? Does the refrigerator that was in the kitchen when we wrote the contract, is that still there? Now this has happened. We had a stainless steel fridge when we wrote the contract. Photos in the MLS show a stainless steel fridge. We get there and there's a black fridge, side by side, cheap $500 scratch and dent fridge. Seller took the refrigerator out. No. Whatever was here at the time of contract has to still be here.
But what it was like when you said the ring where you take it out and you put another one in.
Right.
Why is that different than?
Because on page 1 of the contract, refrigerator is listed in that. So however you have marketed the property is how it would stay. Because it's something that is listed in that list of things that would stay. That specific refrigerator, correct.
So holes in the drywall will include that if you find a walkthrough.
It's kind of a maintenance issue. No, if it's like a big gaping hole, like you took a TV mount out of the wall and there's like a 12-inch hole, that's something different. But I'm talking about like if I pop this off the wall and there's a tiny little like nail pop. I've actually had buyers that are like, no, every bit of this needs to be plastered and repainted. No, that's not how it works.
The only exception to that, in my mind, is that if the original refrigerator died or something, they replaced it, that should be documented.
Correct. There should be documentation that says, hey, the refrigerator died, we're putting a new refrigerator in there. You know, we're gonna get this model.
It should be comparable or better.
Exactly. It should be the same quality or better to what was in there.
Do you recommend writing down, like the buyer's agent writing down the model?
The inspector usually does. So normally when you have the home inspection, they write the model number and serial numbers for all the appliances that are in the house. So that's where I can go back to my inspection report and go, well, the refrigerator was a GE model 23792, serial number, blah, blah, blah. This is a model Kenmore, whatever, whatever. It's not the same. So yeah, definitely. And talk to your home inspector and just make sure they do that. But everyone I've ever had does for that reason. Seller's assistance and cooperation in the closing and the build out or close out of building permits. So if the buyer's inspection of the property identifies open or needed building permits, the seller will promptly deliver to the buyer plans, documentation, blah, blah, blah. So what this essentially says is the seller has to work to close out these permits. That is their obligation. The seller's obligation to cooperate includes the execution of necessary authorizations, blah, blah, blah. So you can't have a seller that says, no, forget it, I'm not gonna deal with that. You're buying a house, it's your problem. Well, no, the contract is pretty specific that it is the seller's obligation to help with that. Now, this is our real estate CYA paragraph. The buyer agrees, and again, it's all caps. This is important. It's bold, it's big. They don't want you to miss this. The buyer agrees to rely solely on the seller, professional inspectors, government agencies for verification of property condition, square footage, and facts that affect the property value, and not on the representations, oral, written, or otherwise, of the broker. This contract is very clear. We're going to convey information to the best of our knowledge. We're going to try to convey information that we know to be correct. But if there's ever a question, send them to the property appraiser, send them to the permit office, send them to the school board. Make them have some obligation to make sure that the information that matters to them is correct. Now, under dispute resolution, so buyer and seller have 10 days after the conflict. Normally, this only really deals with escrow. That the first part is to go to mediation. If they go to mediation and they don't reach a resolution, then they move to litigation. But the parties split equally any mediation fee. It's going to be about $350 per person to go to mediation. If you're arguing over $1,000 escrow, and it's going to cost you $350 to fight it, you know, at what point does that really become a moral victory? So just understand the parties have to split any mediation fee. So just know the seller is going to have to pay for their own mediation to go, and the buyer as well is going to have to pay for it. Then, in any litigation permitted by this contract, the prevailing party is entitled to recover from the non-prevailing party costs and fees, including reasonable attorney fees. So if we go to litigation, Mr. Seller, fighting over this $1,000 escrow and the buyer wins, you now have to pay the buyer's fees and buyer's legal fees, and you're still not getting your $1,000. So that's where you really have to kind of determine how much is this fight worth picking for either side. For title exam, the buyer has 5 days after the receipt of the title commitment to examine it and notify the seller in writing, specifying any defects, if any, that render the title unmarketable. So, title company runs their title search. They come in and go, hey, we've got this blemish on the title, something that has happened, we need to have it remedied. The buyer has to notify the seller within 5 days of receiving that. And then in turn, the seller will have 30 days after receipt to make reasonable effort to remove those defects. Now, 35-day contract. We're day 10 before the buyer receives the title. Okay? We have 5 days to give it to the seller. So it gets to the seller on day 14. The seller now has 30 days to fix it. We only have 15 days left on our contract. Do we need an extension?
Yes.
We still need a closing extension because the seller is going to have to be given 30 days to fix that. But our contract only goes out another 15. So we're going to have to do a minimum of a 15-day extension to give the seller time to remedy it. Now, the seller may be able to go in and go, hey, I can get this done in 2 days. Like it's just a defect, call the title insurance, get it done, it's gone. You may not have to execute an extension, but by law, you could. Typically. But you have to provide notification. The seller is still going to work through the title company because they know how to fix it, but just understand what the timetables look like.
So do you automatically write an extension within it?
You don't have to, because again, you may be able to fix it. Now, here's where this is the only time this has ever come in. I had a listing. It was a manufactured home here in Moon Lake. Doing it for a friend. She apparently had a lien put against her property by an ex-boyfriend. She had surgery, was medicated, whatever. He got her to sign this document. She had no knowledge of it. We go to sell the house, and the title company goes, well, you've got a $75,000 lien against your house that we were selling for $57,000. And she's like, what do you mean? So they had to go through, well, now it's this whole lawsuit. It's been sent to the state's attorney's office. And the attorney told us, look, you're looking at 12 months to fix this. So what we had to do was do a 30-day extension to be able to show, because the buyer's like, no, I still want to buy this house. So they made us do a full 30-day extension. And then we had to get a letter from the state's attorney's office saying, look, we can't remedy this in this time frame. And then we were able to cancel the contract. So that's where title defects kind of come into play. If it's something simple that can be handled by a title insurance, then you can probably get it done in 3 or 4 days and you can still close on schedule. But you may have to extend up to 30 days.
Do you advise sending a title commitment if there are no defects, I mean,
Yeah, just for the sake of documentation. Yeah.
typically we don't, but.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. If there's nothing for the seller to address, then this becomes a non-issue. So basically,
That's why.
correct. So if on day 6 we hadn't sent this to the seller, then it's presumed to be satisfied. So that's kind of one of those. It expires immediately after 5 days that it goes away.
I'm just a little unfamiliar. What exactly is a title?
So what they do is the title company runs a title search. So it goes back and it looks at all the previous owners. It looks at the whole transcript of the ownership of that house since the day it was built. And basically what it does is it goes back and makes sure there are no defects. There's not a kid of somebody that died that actually has rights to the house that wasn't properly conveyed. Now, what's cool about your title insurance, let's say you buy a house, right? That owner's policy that the seller pays for, somebody knocks on your door and goes, hey, I'm John Smith, my dad owned this house, it was my inheritance, I want it back. What you do is you call the title insurance and say, hey, I've got somebody here that's making a claim on this property, I don't know what's going on. You put them in touch with the title insurance, and if nothing else, the title insurance cuts a check to that person because it was missed. That's what your title insurance is for. It protects your right of ownership to that property.
Representing your seller, I suggest you guys double check that the title company checks for municipal liens.
Yeah.
Because some counties don't allow them to do it, and I got stuck with a $3,000 bill because my title company didn't search for municipal liens.
Yeah.
Which means that's like the electric bill.
Yeah, the electric bill, the water bill, sewer bill. Most title companies now are running them, but just double check when they're doing the title search to make sure they're doing a municipal lien search as well. Crown Title I know is really good about doing municipal lien searches. Dynamic, North American, all the big ones around here have all started doing it. Some of these, like when you get these attorneys that do 10 closings a year, those are the ones that don't know to go look for them or whatever, and that's when you can potentially
So the commitment then, just so I'm clear on that, the commitment is just kind of like your loan commitment. It's where we're saying, okay, we'll do a title insurance policy.
So this actually comes from the title company, and it says title commitment. I think it's called a Schedule B.
Okay.
So they send it to you, and it says title commitment, and it goes through and shows, you know, permits outstanding. It'll show none, and usually has a screenshot from the property appraiser showing that there are no open permits. And it's usually about 6 or 7 pages, and it just goes through and shows no liens, no blah 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 on the title, so that you have that. Yep. Now, as we go through time, calendar days are used in computing time periods. You have a 7-day inspection, that is 7 calendar days, not 7 business days. So we write a contract on Saturday, we do a 7-day extension, a 7-day inspection. It ends on a Saturday. We technically have till 5 o'clock on Monday, according to this contract. Now, here's the other thing, and I forgot to touch on it before. So let's say everybody signs and it gets delivered today at 3. When do we start counting calendar days?
The next day, right?
Tomorrow. So tomorrow is day 1. If it comes in at 12:01 a.m. today, when does it start? Tomorrow. So the day it's received is day 0. The next calendar day is day 1. So just keep that in mind, because technically everything was signed on July 11th. Day 1 is technically July 12th. So just kind of understand how those calendar days work. So when you're talking about 30 days for loan approval, you know, it makes a big difference if I start counting today or tomorrow. So just kind of understand how that works.
The day ends at 11:59.
Correct.
Not at 5 o'clock.
Exactly. So calendar date, unless it specifically says 5 o'clock on this date, it is midnight of that day, 11:59:59.
That's in the
Local time. Yeah. That's another very good point.
That should be on there, and it's not.
It's not. And I've talked to attorneys about it, and they all agree. It absolutely. The time is whatever time zone the property is located in. So even though the buyer's in California, they could send it at 2:59:59 because they're 3 hours, I'm sorry, behind, yeah, vice versa. Sorry. I think it's my Google Voice. There we go. I had it backwards. If you were selling a house in California, we send it at 259. Here, it's still 11:59 on the West Coast. That's the thing. So yes, it is whatever time zone the property is located in is considered your local time. So if you have a buyer that's in Arizona, you know, they're going to be 2 hours behind, but the time zone, so they would have to have it out by 10 p.m. to be considered midnight here. Yeah, very good point. Yeah, I don't know why that's not in here, but it absolutely should be. Now, this is where it gets a little bit funny. The location of the closing will take place in the county where the real property is located. Now, I have had it where we have a property in Pasco County, like here in Trinity, but the title company is in Pinellas, in Tarpon Springs. Technically, the contract says it takes place in the county where the real property is located. So we should have our closing in the same county. In reality, I mean,
Well, it says at such other location agreed to by the
right.
parties.
And so that's where it comes in. But this is the part where it's like, it technically should be in the same county. But yeah, otherwise you just have to agree. Now this becomes the argument. Does this agreement have to be in writing?
Should be.
Should be. So now what we need to do is we need to have an extension that buyer and seller agree that the closing will take place in Pinellas County and not Pasco. You know how many times that addendum has ever been done? Not many. So that's where it gets to be an issue, because then it's like, well, okay, well, what does a location agreed to by the parties actually mean? Technically, if the property or the escrow agent on the contract has a Tampa address, then the argument could be made that because everybody was aware of what that address was when they executed the contract, everybody agreed to do it there.
It's always been my understanding too, that on the contract on page 1, it says that escrow shall be held at such and such.
Right.
That doesn't mean the title closing
Exactly. Right.
is going to be held at the same place. We've had escrows held at different places.
Right. And sometimes they get held by real estate companies, sometimes they get held by attorneys, sometimes they get held by, but you're absolutely right. That's just an escrow agent.
I think the general understanding is that when you put that down,
That's where it's going to be.
And there's nothing on that contract that says where the closing is to be held.
Exactly. So that's where that line gets to be a little bit ambiguous. So that's why I like to point that out. Because again, if it became a dispute, then now we're having to go in front of attorneys going, well, what does mutually agreed upon actually mean? How do we have to agree upon it? It doesn't specify. So those are the things in the contract I like to point out just because they're potentially interesting. This is another one. Access to the property to conduct appraisals, inspections, and walkthrough. The seller shall, with reasonable notice, provide utility service and access. Utility service, the electric and the water, right? Your buyer goes in and wants to have an inspection, the power's not on. Whose responsibility is it to have the power on? The seller's obligation. It says right there. There have been a number of times where the seller says, seller will not turn on utilities for inspections.
REO properties.
REOs, yeah. In that case, because it's been disclosed, then you may need to communicate with your buyer to make sure. But per the contract, it's the seller's obligation.
So the buyer does have to notify.
Correct.
Now, when I was looking for a home, we ran into a situation where we were trying to test the pool heater, but the propane tank was empty.
Okay.
And we got stuck paying for it because they didn't want to fill it if they were going to be selling the house.
Mm-hmm.
We agreed to go ahead and pay for it, and then get the money back if there was a problem with the house, which we didn't. But is that considered part of the utility of the house because it's on site, it stays, and you can't test the gas heater for the pool if you don't have any?
If I was an attorney, which I'm certainly not, I would say yes, it's part of the utilities because it is fuel.
Right.
So the same thing. You've got a propane tank. I go to turn on the stove, click, click, click.
Right.
There's no propane in the tank. I can't test that because the utility that drives it is not on. So yeah, I could very easily see the logical argument that says gas would be a part of the utilities.
Sure. Okay.
Now, upon reasonable notice, what does that mean? In essence, what I have been told by attorneys is 24-hour notice is reasonable notice. So upon reasonable notice, give them 24 hours. That is considered reasonable. Some people may argue, well, that's not enough. I need 3 days notice. Technically, 24-hour notice for an inspection or an appraisal walkthrough should be sufficient. So.
But we often give much.
Oh yeah, hey, we're gonna schedule the inspection for next Monday. You know, give them as much as you can. But if you have tenant occupied properties, this is when this gets to be an issue. Okay, well now you're inconveniencing my tenants. I've got to have 5-day notice. Well, in reality, we've got a 7-day inspection period. I can't give you 5-day notice. Reasonable notice is interpreted as 24 hours. So that's not gospel truth. That is just reasonably accepted. And then the last part is W is reserved. At some point, some attorney may make another 10 grand to add something else to this contract. Right now, it's just blank. The buyer waiver of claims. The reason I have this highlighted is because it's a difference between the standard contract and the as-is contract. In an as-is, it says the buyer waives any claims against the seller or any real estate licensee involved in the negotiation for any damage or defects pertaining to the physical condition of the property that exists at closing or subsequently discovered by the buyer or anyone claiming by through blah, blah, blah. It does not relieve the seller's obligation to comply with paragraph 10J, which is the, now 4th time, the material defects. So this still doesn't relieve the seller from not making material defects known to the buyer. This is now the 4th time that this has been mentioned between the property disclosures, the contract, and now in here. So essentially what this says is it's an as-is. The buyer accepts the property in the condition it's in at the time of closing. If the AC breaks the day after the buyer moves in, is it the seller's responsibility? Nope. That's just what it is. So the only other thing I want to touch on before I pop over to the conventional contracts, and I promise I will not spend very long on it, for the addenda. Now, remember how we were talking about this FHA? Let's go back up here. See how it starts with letter E right here? That actually corresponds to this as is. It's actually letter E right here. So that way you know which addenda is included on the contract. So they're all lettered instead of numbered. They're all lettered so you can identify which one actually gets executed with the contract. So if you have one that is part of it, so this is where rider versus addenda, when it's checked on here, it is now a rider. It is a part of that contract because it's being included with this contract because we've checked here that we're including it as part of our contract package. So just pay attention. If it's got something like the HOA, go ahead and check it. If it's FHA, BA, go ahead and check it. If it's lead-based paint, go ahead and check it. That way we know when we look at this contract what riders are supposed to be attached to this contract. Now this is the additional terms part. In as much as you can, leave this blank. Because in essence, what we're doing is we're becoming attorneys when we start adding terms to this. And we're not attorneys. So only put something in here if you absolutely have to. And if you do end up putting something in here, send it to a broker and let us take a look at it. We had an issue a couple of weeks ago. A contract came back. There was a dispute about it. The agent had arbitrarily typed some information in there. Buyer and seller agreed to it, and it conflicted with other terms in the contract, and now we had to get attorneys involved, and it was a giant pain in the butt.
That's another one. I got a good example of a buyer's agent put in 3% of the commission, their commission. The buyer agent did that. Right. And we put on the MLS that was 2.5. They tried to get over on us.
Yep. Yeah, and that's what I mean. That's where, and really, our commissions are not mentioned anywhere on this contract, and they shouldn't be, because this is a contract between the buyer and the seller. Our commission is a negotiated agreement between the seller and, you know, the seller's agent as to what our commission is. It does not belong in this contract. So what a lot of agents will do is they come down here and put buyer's agent dash 3%. It should not be there. Because cooperating sales agent, my name is not Greg Blackall dash 3%. This is a legal document. It should just be my name and my brokerage.
Should you send it back to them and say? no?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Scratch it out and be like, nope.
So what would you put up in that other section?
So the only thing that really gets populated in there would be, I've had instances where the legal description of the property was like 5 lines long and it doesn't fit into the space on page 1. So what I put is see page 12 for full property legal description. And then down here, I put property legal description is, and then put the 5 lines of legal description in here. Or if we were in our buyer's packet, and I think I closed it. If it said, is the buyer asking for the seller to contribute toward closing costs? It automatically populates the correct legal verbiage that says seller to contribute 3% of purchase price toward buyer's closing costs and or prepaid items. If you just have closing costs, the majority of a buyer's closing costs are lender prepaids, insurance prepaid, tax prepaids, things like that. Their actual closing costs are fairly inconsequential. So in theory, your buyer's closing costs aren't going to be anywhere near 3% of the purchase price. The bulk of that are in the prepaid items. So if you just put seller to contribute 3% toward buyer's closing costs, you could potentially have an issue when you get to closing and the seller goes, I'm not paying for lender prepaids or prepaid taxes or anything else because that's not in there. So it automatically generates the legal verbiage for you. But that's really the only thing I've ever used it for.
What is your thought on this? Some agents think that you shouldn't explain the contract, read the contract to your buyers or sellers.
Why not?
Legally, I just have heard that, legally you shouldn't read it word for word. What if you're missing something?
Mm-hmm.
You don't
So
know.
ultimately, it is the buyer's responsibility if they have questions to consult with an attorney. How many contracts do we do over the course of a year? Hopefully a lot. How many does that typical buyer do? Maybe 3 in their life. It's my job to understand this document and point out the things that are important. It is still their responsibility if they have questions about the document to seek legal advice. But me as an agent, I want to, and actually what I typically do is keep a blank contract and I point out a few things. The buyer's diligent effort. I make it a point to point that out. We talk about your escrow amount. See, this is going to be the purchase price. This is your escrow amount. Your cash at closing is deducted by $5,000 because you're putting that in escrow. You do get that credited back to you at closing. It's not just money that disappears because they do have confusion about it. So as I go through, I don't do what I just did with you guys and walk through every single line, but I do point out, okay, we're going to have 7 days for an inspection period. What that means is we're going to have an inspection. We have to provide it to the seller, and then the seller can decide what they will or won't do at that point. But this is our window for that. For lending, you have to make a loan application within 5 days. That means as soon as this contract is executed, you're calling your lender and making formal application. There's a few things like that that I do sit and kind of point out, but I don't go line by line, section by section to go through it with them. So, and what I tell them is, if you do have any questions about this is a contract for a $100,000 home. It's a big deal. I really want to make sure you understand it. Read through it. If you have questions, I will do the best I can to answer it. If I can't answer it, I'm going to advise you to talk to an attorney. I have a great real estate attorney that would be more than happy to talk to you. Absolutely. Because they want to know that we know what we're doing. So at least if I can take the time, and I've had people that were like, this is the 5th house I bought, and nobody has ever explained this contract to me. I had no idea that I was obligated to that. So honestly, I can't fathom how many people execute these real estate contracts that have no idea what they've agreed to.
It's a cell phone contract,
Exactly. Just
$100.
whatever. I don't have a choice. Just sign it. Well, no. There's a lot of stuff in here that have some pretty far-reaching implications. I really want to make sure you guys understand what you're committing yourselves to.
So how do you just present it with, digital signature and all that? How do you present it separate and then send
Yeah.
it to sign?
So typically what I do is when we are getting ready to write an offer, I sit down and say, okay, there's a couple of things I want to talk through with you. Let's talk through the contract. Here's a couple of points I just want to point out. And then I send it to them digitally, and then they go click sign, click sign, click sign, click sign, click sign. And it literally scrolls page to page and they never read a word on it.
So the blank one is the one that you go over.
Yep, absolutely. And that's just me. I mean, a lot of agents literally will just send it to them and just go click, 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 and they've not read a single word on that contract. It happens all the time, and I cringe. So every time a new version of this contract comes out, I call my real estate attorney and go, dude, you're taking me to lunch. We're gonna go sit. And he's like, okay, let's go. So, and we sit down and I say, okay, they're changing this line, you know, because they always release a red line version before they roll it out. I take the red line version and go, okay, what does this really mean? Like, tell me in legal, like, what changes in the obligation? I'm kind of stupid about it.
You guys let us know.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, the only other thing I want to touch on here is just the buyer's address and the seller's address. The title company needs this information. Just put it on the contract. Ask the buyer, hey, what is your current address? That's literally the extent of how hard that is to get. What is your current address? 123 Main Street. Okay, awesome. For the seller's address, I use whatever's in tax records. If the seller lives in New York and their registered address is New York, that's what I put on the contract. So what this says is if the title company or the lender or anybody needs to send information, what address do we send it to? Buyers agents, for whatever reason, are totally lazy and almost never fill this in. So what's going to happen? You send it to the title company, and the title company goes, all right, here's a buyer input form. Now I need you to fill out this buyer input form that's going to have the buyer's name, their address, their phone number, their email, blah, blah, blah. Well, if I have that, I can go through and fill that out and get it done. Otherwise, now I'm having to call the buyer and go, hey, so now I need all this extra information that I really should have gotten up front. It just makes me look like an amateur. So that's the other thing. So very, very quickly, because I can tell I'm glossing you guys over. Let me send this in. All right. If you notice, this is page 1 of 13. The as-is contract is 12 pages. The regular residential contract is 13, and there's, that's no big deal. The reason why is right here. The seller will pay the following amounts for general expenses, for WDO treatment, or for costs associated with closing out or expired permits. If you want to lock a buyer into a contract that they can't get out of, use this one. So 1.5% if left blank. $150,000 home or $100,000 home, the seller is agreeing up to $1,500 for general repairs. Buyer has an inspection. Buyer asks for $5,000 in repairs. Does the seller have to do it? Nope. Can the buyer back out? Nope. Because you're asking up front for the seller to commit to a certain amount for repairs. That is all the seller is obligated to do. You can't back out in an inspection contingency because you want more than what the seller is willing to agree to. You guys have already signed this contract.
Which contract?
This is the standard contract. So if you've got a buyer that you're like, or your seller's like, hey, I want to lock this in. Okay, cool. Let's set some amounts in these 3 boxes. That is the most the seller is willing to pay. If it is 1 dime over that, the seller doesn't have to do it, and the buyer can't back out. Because you've agreed in writing that the seller is only obligated to make this amount of repairs.
As a buyer's agent, you can send up the counter offer with an as-is.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, as a seller's agent, how would you recommend presenting that to your seller?
99% of the time, you don't. Industry standard is an as-is contract. That's what everybody's comfortable with. That's what everybody wants. The only time I have had this is when I had an investor flip, and then there was a buyer that came in, and so we went ahead and used the standard contract, and we capped this out at $500, this at $250, and this for $1,000. So what we did was the seller had just renovated this entire home. There was nothing that needed done, but he got burned on the first contract because a buyer came in on an as-is and said, oh, the front yard needs to be resodded and blah, 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 blah. And he was like, screw that. So we switched over to the standard contract, and then the next buyer was happy and perfect and everything went fine. They didn't ask for anything. But because he got burned by an as-is, you know, it was 2 weeks for an inspection. On day 14, they asked for all these stupid things, and the seller's like, no, I just put $80,000 in rehabbing this home. I'm not resodding the front yard because it hadn't rained in 5 days and the grass was brown, whatever. So pretty much everything else is the same until you get down here. So when you get to inspections, the buyer has X number of days to perform those inspections, and then the items identified, which the seller is obligated to repair or replace up to the amount that they've agreed to, the seller will go through and do those. The buyer will, within the inspection period, inform the seller of any repair items that are not in the condition required by the lender typically, and then will request the seller to do it. Property condition, same thing. General property repairs. So there's a lot more in here because agreed to amount of money. So this quantifies what the seller would actually have to do.
I'm sorry.
That's
I
okay.
keep seeing WDO. What is that?
It's wood destroying organisms. So that's fungus, termites,
Gotcha.
those kind of wood rot. That's a WDO. Typically we think of it as termites, but it's actually any wood destroying organism. Ants, yeah. Now the repair standard. So on here, all repairs and replacements will be completed in a good and workmanlike manner by an appropriately licensed person in accordance with all requirements of law, and shall consist of materials of quality, value, capacity, and performance comparable to or better than whatever existed, except as provided in that paragraph. At the buyer's option and cost, the seller will at closing assign all repair, treatment, and maintenance contracts and warranties. On an as-is contract, the seller has no obligation to transfer AC warranty, roof warranty, anything else. This is a common misconception. Oh, the AC has a 10-year warranty. Awesome. Unless you specifically ask that seller to transfer it to your buyer, they have no obligation to do so.
Why would you just say? I mean, if you're not gonna be there, right? Okay.
I don't know, but this contract takes it a step to say at the buyer's option and cost. Now, sometimes to transfer that warranty is like a $200 processing fee. So at the buyer's option and cost, the seller will assign those warranties. But just understand, under an as-is contract, none of those things have to be conveyed. So just kind of some interesting nuances. And then there was the last part. And there may not be. Nope, that was the end of it. That's the biggest difference between the as-is and the standard contract. The standard contract, seller agrees to the repairs up front, and everybody's locked in at that point. It's $1 over that. Sorry, here's $1,500 worth of work. You can pay for the rest, or I keep your escrow. So more often than not, we're going to use this as-is contract. That's kind of the industry standard. That's what everybody's used to. If you send over anything other than an as-is, the seller's agent's going to freak out and go, holy crap, what is this? Why are you sending me this piece of alien technology? Like, that's kind of what it is. What they don't realize is it is actually to the seller's benefit to use the standard
So if there is a termite warranty
contract.
on a property,
Yep.
what do you recommend?
Typically just finding out who the company is and then having the buyer contact that termite company to say, hey, I'm buying this property, there's a termite contract, what do I need to do to transfer it? And then what they may have to do is reach out to the seller to get permission to talk to the new buyer, you know, to make sure.
You actually did an addendum.
Yeah.
So they knew.
Yep. Again, I am a huge proponent of documenting everything. So I would much rather have 5 addenda that make sure everybody's clear than to just assume, and then we get to closing and the buyer goes, oh, well, we talked about this, and the seller's like, no, we didn't. And then now we have a dispute over something that we did actually talk about but never got documented. So do you guys have any questions about contracts, addenda, anything like that?
Since we're always still in the closing date, where does that come from? Like, where does that date come? Where do you get that?
Typically the lender and your buyer. So if the buyer says, hey, I need, you know, I've got to be out of my house in 60 days, I'd like to close in 55. Okay, cool. The lender says, hey, on this particular loan file, give me 45 days. I can probably close it in 30, but give me 45 just to be safe. Those are the kinds of conversations you want to have to determine. By default, if you put 45 days on a contract, you're typically okay. Almost all the lenders with TRID and everything now are closing deals. The industry standard is 36 days. So if you put 45, you've got a little bit of wiggle room in there. Aaron and Jaron at Cross Country are closing FHA deals in 22 days, like consistently.
So if you put a date on there, but you want to close early, you have to come back and change that date?
So both parties have to agree to close before then. So you can go to the seller and say, hey, financing is moving, we're gonna have a clear to close by the 15th instead of the 30th. Is the seller okay with that? And the seller may go, well, we're gonna be in our house on the 22nd, we do that. So it becomes a back and forth, and then I would just do a contract addendum that says closing date is moved from July 30th to July 22nd. It is, but again, it's still better to have the documentation to actually adjust the closing date. Yep.
How many days did you say was industry standard?
45. Most lenders now are able to do it in 35, 36. That's 7 weeks. The biggest thing is how quickly they order appraisal, how quickly you have your inspections and get your insurance bound. In hurricane season, bind your insurance as early as you can. You can bind it for an effective date, but if we have this weird tropical storm that popped up in the Gulf and now we get a window where they can't lock insurance, we could potentially have to ask for closing because we can't bind. Most insurance companies will bind up to like 3 weeks out, 3 or 4 weeks in some cases. So bind your insurance as early as you can. It may mean that your buyer is going to have to pay the premium to get it bound, but the lender can always, play with the numbers. So at closing, it comes out of what they have to bring, whatever. But bind your insurance, especially during hurricane season. There is nothing in the world more frustrating than the storm comes within that 200-mile box. Even though it's on the other side of the coast, doesn't impact us at all. It's in our box, we don't close. So just my little extra tidbit. So thank you guys for coming. I know that was a lot of information. I know that was just a ton to throw at you. But it's really, really good stuff. And I'm going to have this so that you guys can start recording that.